do just want to take a moment to introduce our esteemed presenters today, longtime members and friends of AEE, presenters at pretty much every conference since around the time I was born, I think. Dr. Brent Bell, Dr. Michael Gass, if you don't know them and you're running an outdoor orientation program, you probably should. Between the two of them, they've published more research than just about anybody else in the field. And I don't want to take up any more time. I know they have a lot of content to deliver, so suffice to say, we're very fortunate to have them here with us today and excited to learn from you all. Go ahead and pass it on over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. And Mike and I are happy to be doing this, and so glad to have people joining us in our virtual conference here. So yes. We're going to start out here, and I thought Mike and I could both introduce ourselves just a little bit with our background. So I'll let Mike go first and have some notes here for him.
Right. I'm talking about just my engagement with outdoor orientation programs, and for me, that began back in the late 1970s, and I really achieved my learning under the tutelage of Craig Dobkin and the people from Project Marge. Marge was named after Marjorie, who died in a climbing accident on a Colorado Outward Bound course, and Craig dedicated the orientation program to her. And so for 2 years, I worked with the Marge program. We went to climbing down the volcanoes down in Mexico and went on Denali on the next summer. So it really was far-reaching programs. Then I came to UNH in 1981 and began a pilgrimage, I think, in creating the UNH Fireside program, and actually did my doctoral dissertation on the effects of outdoor orientation programs. And I've written quite extensively about this. And then also I was lucky enough to find a student such as Brent Bell and chaired his doctoral dissertation.
Yeah, thanks. And for me, Mike was a pretty significant person to me as an undergrad, and I was here with the group that Mike was studying for his dissertation, and so I felt like I knew about the program, and I knew a lot of that research work from a very personal angle. And I went on to start some outdoor orientation programs. A number of years working at Harvard, managing a large program there, and then did my doctorate with Mike studying outdoor orientation programs. And since that time, I've written, I think, 19 papers, and I've been coordinating the outdoor orientation program symposium for years. So I think between the both of us, we have some deep experience on the research end of this, and also understand some of the program concerns that directors have. So we're really glad to be with folks today. Today, basically, what we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about the history of outdoor orientation programs, a little bit about some unique features, talk about research, and then we're really hoping that this all sets up, I think, is an important conversation right now about theory and theories of outdoor orientation. So I hope that this is enjoyable for folks, and we'll get started. So I'm going to start just talking about like a real kind of quick history, but I think it's important, as there's really two places that outdoor orientation programs come from. And really this begins in 1932. The Dartmouth Outing Club starts a pre-orientation program really to get people to join their club. So there wasn't really any like student developmental goals at the time. But what they wanted to do is get people up to Dartmouth who might be excited about doing some camping or hiking, and if they weren't, get them excited so that they would join the club and they could make a more active club. And so what happened in that Dartmouth story is that it was very successful, but through the success, students were finding these developmental outcomes. Some positive things were happening on the side, which is different from sort of the second starting, I say, is the Prescott College story. And at Prescott, the history really began with a president who was thinking that students needed more of I don't know, like kids these days had it too easy and wanted them to have an outward bound experience. Outward bound is becoming very popular, and want to give them a full outward bound kind of course. And I think from these kind of models, sort of this like student development model, this student recreation model, came programs like UNH Fireside, which was like Mike was part of organizing and developing, and these experiences. And so the next set of slides, we just kind of talk about, like, Dartmouth. If you don't know the story of Dartmouth, it was considered a very grim place to live and a grim place to go to college. But someone there, in a very outward ed way, reframed that. And they reframed it into, like, creating the Dartmouth Winter Carnival, creating all these, like, great things at Dartmouth where they did a lot of outings. And from that, Dartmouth is known as having this great, lodges. This is the Moose Lock Ravine Lodge, and great infrastructure and lots of land to really celebrate the outdoors. And through that, really created this great idea of the for outdoor orientation. Similarly, I was talking about, like, Prescott. It was, like, sort of developmental, really wanting to, like, challenge students. It's funny, they talked to, like, Roy Smith, who was the first director of the program, and he says, the president really wanted me to just, like, really toughen up these students. And so their course was different than Dartmouth, and that it really had developmental concerns. And so we can see from their program, they were single gender trips back in those days, and those led to sort of what I consider, like, the growth of outdoor orientation. And so, and this is a picture that I think this is at Princeton, but we see these on by 1985, we see all kinds of programs. And so this is what I think really led to the UNH Fireside program. And I think Mike's going to talk just a little bit about how that was maybe unique coming from these two influences historically.
Sure. The biggest part for the Fireside program was the integration of students coming into the university and really trying to make an affiliation or an attachment to the individuals. We had looked at a lot of the work that Winston, Miller, and Prince had done. And one of the things that we saw that was so critical was, how do you create this connection that's a special place for students coming in? Because this is a time in their life where they are transitioning from a family system of 17, 18 years to realistically creating a new family system in their lives. And there's really no other time in an individual's life where there is such room for transition. And that was where we centered a lot of our work. And so what we did is we did 5 days prior to the incoming freshman year, first year. And then we did a follow-up program halfway into the semester. We did a 2-day follow-up in January, and then we did a single-day follow-up in the spring again. So the idea is that how could we formalize this integration of attachment, but then also how could we foster the development of this attachment in informal ways? And one of the ways that worked so well is that a lot of the families now came together on Sunday night for the dinner table. So they literally would go to one of the dining halls, and it was standard practice that at 6 o'clock, the family would get together and it would have dinner. And now it wasn't required that you went, but it was a time that you could come back and make reattachments. And that's what led to a lot of the successes into this program. We used students as the leaders because we felt that this modeling type of experience was so important to them. And the metaphors of the experiences were designed heavily to integrate into this coming and arriving to this new place. So like on the last day, we actually had students run, walk, or bike 5 miles onto campus. And we had people who came out of their offices on campus and literally cheered them on along the way when they arrived. So that arrival became a metaphor for their coming and transitioning into college.
So I think this is like, I think part of this that's important too is that I think in Mike's time and like in the 80s when we're setting up Fireside is really the time when we have 10, 12 years of these type of programs, and I think become really intentional about what we're trying to do. So one of the other programs I know that does a lot of like post-trip get-togethers, like Mike was discussing, that happened at Fireside, where the students not only went on the trip, but they would reconnect in January, they'd reconnect in March. Is at West Virginia does a great job of this partly because they're set up to students to get credit through a class. And what that does is they have sort of assignments throughout the first semester for 10 weeks, which involve a lot of reflection, a lot of thinking about that experience and how it could have more meaning. And I think that we're finding in the data that we've been looking at that's an important component that you do the follow-up. So we're kind of thinking about this idea, and Dan has this idea to do polls here. So you can, what if you're right in, but if you kind of think about, like, if your program that you have was influenced by one of these models, and so if it started in the early days out of like a Dartmouth, more recreational, short trip, 5-day model, or if it started, out of the Prescott, or remember, I consider like the UNH WVU model, although there are many other schools were doing that in those days of kind of continued reflection. So something that we want to help us by giving your thoughts there. And I want to turn to Mike, and Mike's going to talk a bit about the key components in the programs we found.
Key components that we found that we centered around, and this was based a lot in the college orientation and developmental literature that was not outdoors, is the attachment to a positive peer group and the occurrence of an unfamiliar or novel environment. We definitely focus on small group development, 7 to 12, where we had 2 to 3 leaders. And we utilized challenging activities that were aimed at developing group support and fostering this identity of close group interaction. We were definitely working towards specific goals. We would literally sit down, and with their junior or senior level leader, they would write goals and write letters to themselves that we would send back to the students during the semester. And then focusing on transfer of learning to the new environment. And the learnings that I experienced from Fireside and the evaluation that occurred from 1981 to 1986, when I did my doctoral dissertation, led towards the publication of an article called Programming the Transfer of Learning in Adventure Education. And that was published in the JEE in 1986.
I'm going to go ahead and share the results of that poll so you all get a sense of who's in the room. Looks like most folks are following the Dartmouth shorter trip recreational model, but a few of the other ones as well. Can you see that, Mike and Brent?
Yes.
Great.
You can. Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll, I gotta say that. There we go.
So realistically, and it was good to see the survey there, that there are different focuses that I've seen programs in the profession take. And the first is recreational, and these tended to be the shorter programs, but the idea was to just have fun and enjoy the arrival onto this new experience. And Carl Ronke taught me the idea that fun is really an acronym. It's not a word. It's fun is functional understanding, not necessary. So FUNN, functional understanding, not necessary. There wasn't a whole lot of theory behind it. They just said it works, get people to be engaged, and this is a great break to have. Education was to teach people about colleges and the processes. So what you see this fun time things happen, because fun is the antidote for apathy. And I think this is one thing you want to stay away from with first-year students is apathy, but just to catch people having fun, but then have them reflect about the process through debriefing. Developmental is it's starting to make this move to attach learning and focus and frame learning around specific college student developmental tasks. Like we know that positive peer groups are critical for students' adjustments. Then therapeutic is that not to say that they're diagnosed with a deficiency, but to say here are some gaps in your training and your development, and here's how you should work to make these things stronger. And so that's where you see specific sitting down and one-to-one counseling around specific deficits. So those are kind of the ranges of programs, not to say that those are the only ones, but generally speaking is that the further right that you go on this model, the more that you need staff that are trained to handle those types of situations.
Yeah, and I think it emphasizes to me that it's that that there's a wide range of what we can do and what we can expect from these programs. And so I find at the very minimum, I say, is the least of the programs is that students will have fun in my research, you know, and the programs that are very, very like developmentally focused or spend more time on their curriculum, and the students tend to have a more impactful experience is generally what happens. So, but one of the things that we wondered, and just for, we want people to sort of think about is whether your program's philosophical type kind of matches what your institution wants. And I know Mike talks about this a lot. And,
Yeah.
what do you call it? The coin of the realm?
Yes. What's interesting is that it'd be nice to say that the Fireside program continues to go on. It actually was closed by a new college president whose belief system was we can spend some of this money on these adventure programs, or what we can do is we can buy hidden cameras that can be filming student behavior downtown on the day that the Patriots lose the Super Bowl. And so that was used, that's where the money went from Fireside from one year to the next because of the belief system there. And sad to say, the cameras are still there.
Yeah, and so I think that this is something that I've always learned from Mike, and he's always emphasized, is really trying to always kind of look at your institution and try to match, you know, make sure your program goals are consistent with what the college administration is looking for, and know that you're threatened when those don't match, you know. But part of this also, we think this matters because we think that the philosophy really matters in your program. And so, and I think that the one thing that a lot of you who know me, I've shared was pretty impactful to me was looking at two different programs. And the research study, the students were writing essays about the impact of the program. And on program number one, I'll say, I think had a very recreational based philosophy in that, and what was the students were all saying was fun, it was enjoyable, I would recommend other people doing it, you know, it was a good time, you know, like why wouldn't you do that? And then on the second program, it was really striking that the difference was students were writing about like, this was life-changing, this is the best time I've ever had in my life, these are people that I will always be close to, I plan on inviting them to my wedding, you know, I plan, and so what we really believe is that there's certain factors and certain emphasis in the curriculum that can make the difference between those two situations, and part of that's a philosophical difference. So that's something we want to talk about. So we talked, we're going to talk a little bit about just what we think is some of maybe the key variables in outdoor orientation that lead to growth. And so we'll go through these, and a lot of these are probably familiar to people. This is stuff that we share in outdoor education, but the idea of like leader alliance that is used therapeutically a lot. That's sort of like this therapeutic alliance point here, but the idea that we have positive role models. Trust, we think, is a really important factor, that students talk about trusting their group and leaders at levels that are higher sometimes than they've come from in their normal life. This idea of a positive culture that they're part of that's really healthy and they feel belonged and accepted. And this idea of like a new and vigorous learning experience. And so we think that that's key, that we talked earlier about this being novel. And lastly, this sort of sense of belonging.
A big thing for me has always been the development of student leaders. And I think, you know, as people are asking questions about responding to it, what about when incoming students respond to the experience that was irrelevant? I think that's where the backbone to address that issue comes from junior and seniors in the experiences. Say, they start off with the introduction with everyone there, and then when they get in groups, they lean over to the junior, senior and say, well, what is it really like here? This is what I've heard. And for them to speak the truth and to say, this is really what is going to happen. These are the choices that you have, I think adds huge validity to the process.
Absolutely. So we're gonna do is gonna talk a little bit about research, and I see there's just some questions that are coming up, so we'll try to respond to those in a minute. But we're gonna kind of push through this next section and just kind of give you an idea of what we're doing. And this is actually not OOPS research that you see a picture of, but I put it up there because I think that this is part of the future, is I think that we're going to get into studying things like cortisol and oxytocin and testosterone and things like that as our OOPS research continues. But right now we're a fairly young field. We have about 30 peer-reviewed studies, about 11 dissertations, and I'd say like our total literature, if you take in like of all our studies, is around 100 right now. The good news is that's been growing through the last 10 years, but but I think that it's something that we need more studies, and we're kind of at this really important time about research. I don't know if we want to talk about that, Mike. We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, and this is something that Brent and I may disagree on, is that I'm thinking, and you heard Brent use the term that I use a lot of times, what's the coin of the realm? What's the value system? And to me, the value system comes down to retention of students, academic behavior, and the development of kind of personality traits. And they go in that order. So I think that that's the major thing, is that if you really want, my plea for you, if you really want to do research, you'd follow that paradigm, because that feeds into kind of what we need to be developing as a field. So do you disagree with that?
No.
All right.
No.
So there.
But I think it's something that we both agree on too, is the need for, Mike has always telling me about the need for a base, right? We need to sort of have things defined and have a strong base to build upon. And so part of that was, and I started doing research, is to just do some census and try to just collect how many programs there are, and are we growing, are we not growing? And so a lot of you seen this data before, but basically we have really good news. We have each year about over 25,000 participants that go on outdoor orientation programs. So that's larger than Knowles by quite a bit. More students than Outward Bound. We have about 3,000 student leaders, and I think that it's as a whole, if we bring everything together, it's quite a large impact of outdoor education as a whole. And we can see that these programs have been growing. I'm going to kind of quickly go through some of this data that's in our paper on some of the census stuff. But basically, what we've seen is that we're moving towards increases in leader training and increases in the cost of programs, or I should say the slight decrease in leader training, about the same, but cost, I think it goes along with the professionalism and increased expectations that are happening around programs. And so programs are kind of at that 5.5-day model is pretty average right now. Looking at sort of dependent variables, these are things that have been studied, and I just ask people to look at these and see if you can kind of see the theme. I mean, we have retention and GPA, which are great dependent variables. The rest of them, like social support, self-efficacy, self-satisfaction, self-concept, sense of community, are all kind of like similar types of variables. And I think that that's because we have a sense that these things impact people's sort of bonding and trust and their interrelationships with each other. But we have a hard time sort of finding like the variable that we really influence the most strongly. And so that's one of the things that we're looking for, is what are the new dependent variables? Is it more communication stuff? Grit has been sort of popular lately, and I've been doing some research on that. And part of this is because we look at the qualitative research, and we find really very, very strong outcomes from the qualitative research. Mike did a great study with Dan Garvey and Deb Sugarman on the effects from that Fireside program 17 years later, where they interviewed students. And I don't want to talk a little bit about that, but I'd say those students were heavily impacted even 17 years later.
Yeah, it was really amazing. I went to interview one of the students who participated in the program. And as I walked into her home in northern New Hampshire, she said, wait a minute. And she went to her bedroom and opened up the bureau, and on the top drawer she came out and she says, this is the bandana. And I remember her receiving this bandana from the group, and she wore it every time she went backpacking. So it was really well worn and tattered. but she said, "This is the one that I received 17 years ago, and it really changed my life from that experience." And it just was amazing to hear the stories of people and how influential these experiences were. And it was really redeeming as a researcher to see how valuable and stories like this happen.
Yeah, and so I think that to me is always reinforced. Like I read a lot of great stuff like this that where students sort of are in qualitative research. They talk about how powerful and important the experiences are. And for those of you on this webinar, I really appreciate your work on this. I think it's really good work and it's highly valued. Suffice to say, that same power doesn't always come out in the types of quantitative measures that we try to do in survey research, and that's one of the interesting parts of interesting questions in doing research in this area. So I just leave that out there to think about sort of some of the challenges of research. But I wonder, like, if we asked you, what is the variable you're most interested in measuring? Just to think about, like, what is the variable that would make a difference at your school and what you're interested in.
And when we get to the Q&A, we'll talk about that. So
Yeah.
just think ahead on that.
So the one that we sort of talked about and Mike's talked about is this like retention study. And so Mike did a really great retention study that was pretty powerful. And I'm gonna have to ask him to talk about his study a little bit.
Yes, you're looking at my life in the 1980s, because that's how long it took for this to do. When we started the program here, we developed it and we tracked retention after 2 semesters, and we found that there was a significant difference between an outdoor orientation program and a camp-based program. And this is a program where students went for the same number of days and just stayed at a camp and did camp type of fun activities. Then we did the no program comparison group, and you can kind of see the retention after 2 semesters, and we were approached significance after 7 semesters. But you can see not only the statistical significance, but the practical significance between those programs.
Yeah, and I think that and looking at other retention studies, this one here, and I'm sorry that I define the lines for you, but the green line, it represents an outdoor orientation program over 15 years. And the blue line is a classroom pre-orientation program. And what happens is at the beginning of this program, these are retention data. So the higher the number, the higher percentage retention. So on the left-hand side, the first green dot is 83% retention compared to 71%. But what happens is that over the years is that the kind of activities and small group work and peer leadership and those important factors that were being done in the outdoor orientation program and were successful were then copied by the other classroom pre-orientation program that was on campus. And by sort of mimicking some of those experiences and factors, we see that they have similar retention by the time they reach 1995. And so I think that this kind of that idea that we really believe that curriculum makes a big difference in how we organize these programs. It's not simply because people are outdoors. I just want to talk a little bit about the sort of most recent research and other retention data. There's a study that
Brent, can I interrupt just a second? I want to make sure folks and I understand correctly. When you're talking about retention, you're talking about students staying in that school, finishing up their program, becoming alumni of that university or college.
Yeah, so retention can be sort of measured like semester to semester, and also measure the people that complete to graduation. And so what we're looking at there is like that students who the biggest variable in retention is first to second semester retention, and then after that it's first year to second year retention. Those are kind of the most variable points. And so what that last slide we're talking about is like from first year to second year retention rates, and who comes back in the sophomore year. And what we find is that if like at West Virginia, for instance, they find that if they impact retention by 7 or 8% from students that go on the program compared to those that don't, that translates into millions of dollars. That translates into a lot of money. And it also translates to a lot of students being more successful by, kind of making it through college, which is the intended goal. So, so it's kind of a variable that that everyone to sort of value, right?
Thanks.
And I'll just talk here that the most recent findings, and these are, I'm happy to sort of share these papers with people if anyone wants to email me, but we just 2 retention studies had just come out, and I was fortunate to work on one of them. We had this, if people know Wally Rood, he just, his dissertation was on student thriving and and seeing that outdoor orientation have an indirect impact on that. Forrest Shorts and CJ Belknap, who did a study at West Virginia about students like increasing emotional intelligence. So I think what's great is that there's so much more research going on now, and I think it's a really vibrant time for us right now. But we still need, as Mike said, we got to figure out what the most important variables are and which ones we really hit on. And so I'll stop it there if we want to, if any questions about research. I think Dan will do is if you want to send these to Dan, we'll try to get to those after, but I want to give people a chance. We don't want to answer all your questions about research, and whether on the webinar or after the webinar, we'll get back to you.
We'll go through these.
Sure. So go ahead and type those questions in now, and we'll try to answer them during this presentation.
Yeah. And so one of the one of my questions, this is kind of just to set this up, this next part of it, is that this idea is that we have types of research questions too, and I think just to think of a little bit about and reflect, like, what kind of research. People often say that, we really need more research, but there's research on the census and kind of like the state of outdoor orientation programs, how many they are, what their size is, what their medical procedures are. There's individual program outcomes, how does your program doing? And then there's like this idea of like theory and exploring like how they work, and are there sort of curricular changes that someone can make. And so this is one of the things that we want to sort of spend a little bit of time talking about, is this idea of theory. And because we think that this is like a really important part of our work, of Mike and I and other researchers, and what we sort of need the help of the practitioners to work with this. And so coming up with this grand theory is a difficult thing. We have a couple of claims here. Like, one is that, quotes by like Upcraft and Gardner, who are real leaders in first year experience programming. The idea talking about how important the first year experience is in students being successful. And then people know Noah Levitz. They do a lot of first year consulting, and they really believe that the first experiences that a first year student has may be the largest determinant on whether they feel successful or unsuccessful in college. And there's a lot of psychological research that kind of supports this idea of like you coming in, you establish an identity, and you reinforce that identity, whether it's successful or unsuccessful. And so if these things are true, then we think we need a theory that helps support students right away. And what I want to say is that there's multiple theories, but one of the things we want to talk about, and I think this is to me a conversation I really like having, this idea of, do we base things in a psychological theory? And what I mean by that is that when you go on these programs, do you believe that the programs educate people and they change and they grow individually from that program, and they kind of take that change with them to class and to their residence hall, etc.? Or is it the system that changes people? And for what I mean by system is like, is it the culture on the trip, and that it's such a wonderful culture and a reinforcing kind of benevolent system that everyone is successful in that system, but when they leave that system and go into a different system, they don't really take the change with them, other than they have the knowledge that they've been part of a better system. And so what I think those are important distinctions for people to think about, and like how their program operates and how they think about their program. And usually, and Mike and I talk about this, quite a bit, and this idea that, people, I think, we have a lot of evidence that people are impacted by the systems, but they also like impact individual growth. And so what we want to do in the next sort of section here, I'm going to talk a little bit about my theory and talk about that. Do you want to add?
No, I'll give you the 2 minutes we have.
Okay. So the idea here is I really believe that I kind of put my theory into these two questions. I think the very first thing that students want to know is, do they belong when they get on campus? And the idea of the status question is, how do I belong? I think is also an important question. I want to explain that a little bit. So the do I belong is pretty simple in that, do you fit in? And I think this is a predominant human fear. I think I think belongingness is a really important motivational factor in any human's existence. And so it shows up in these transitions, and it shows up at college. The how do I belong is a little bit different. So this is kind of a funny cartoon. And so this is like, this is three guys showing up for a date. And this idea like of status may be important. So if I was, dating someone, I would sort of have this idea that I want the status of being a significant other to that person, and not be just one of many people. And so there's just times in our lives when we want different statuses, and I think what happens in the groups is that people can belong but not really like their status. So in this case, these three guys belong. They're sort of accepted and they're encouraged to date this woman, let's say, but then they all sort of have equality with each other, which they do not like. And I kind of consider that like an important question about how we think about status. And so for me, I try to explain it like this: is that I grew up with horses, and and a lot of you might have heard this story before that me, but our horses had a definite status system. And you went out to feed the horses. They were in open stalls, which meant that they could push each other out of the way for food. And Trudy always ate first, and then Maury, and down the line. And Trudy, no one would ever get in Trudy's way. That was because Trudy was the alpha horse in our barn. And so what I often want to know with students is like, is that the way that we are on our trips? Are we like horses, and do we need a status system? And are there higher status students on our programs, or do we try to work for more equity? And I think that most of our programs, when we talk about no discount and full value contracting and things like this, really have this basis in wanting this equity. And I believe that may be more important to the success of our trips than we often think. And so that's been an area of research I've been doing. And I think that and I'm just like, one thing to emphasize this, I guess I think that of like, if there's any time when status is really important in your life, it's probably in high school. And I think that's probably the most status sensitive time of your life. And I think what I'm seeing some of these outcomes is that students go from this very status sensitive time to fearing what their status is going to be in college, getting to college, and coming into a very equal, accepting environment where there's very little status. And I think that that's a wonderful experience for students when they do get to experience that. So to me, I think that might be part of the theoretical underpinning of why these programs are important. So
let's do this. Let's save our concluding thoughts, and we'll turn to questions for a while and work on that. And I see two questions that I'll answer. The first one is to Shane. And Shane, you bring up a great point in terms of outcomes research. What is the easiest ones to measure directly after a program? And the thing is that your institution is already collecting data, and you don't need to do a whole lot of times except to get access to that data. It's called unobtrusive measures. So one of the things is to look at your Division of Student Affairs, see what information they're already collecting for their interests, because you're not the only one interested in retention. You're not the only one interested in GPAs. It may be that your university and college, unbeknownst to you, is already collecting much of the data that you would use to evaluate your program. So using this unobtrusive data, this is data that's already being collected that you don't really need to do a whole lot to get, is exactly where I would turn to answer your question, Shane. And then Nick, for yours and eighth grader outdoor education programs, one of the best sets of research studies that ever been done were done by Diane Hedin and Joseph Conrad. And they were done back in the late 70s, early 80s. And unfortunate to say, and well, fortunate for Hedin and Conrad, is that their study was so complete and comprehensive. We as a field really haven't done anything to match it since that time. So they looked at not only the psychological and sociological, they looked at academics, and they found changes from outdoor education programs compared to traditional education, internship programs, service learning programs. They really did a comprehensive study. And for her work, Diane was granted the Kurt Hahn Address back in the 80s. So that's where I would turn for the answer to those questions. Do you want to add anything to those two?
Not to those two. I was going to talk about Jeff's question up there too.
Okay, go for it.
And it says, what about students who respond by thinking their experience was irrelevant, though? And so I think that that's always a risk, is getting students to notice the programming and notice the curriculum. I think that one of the, I guess in this, like, you know, when I've done the studies on this, I'd say like a vast majority of programs that I've studied find these experiences very important. But there are some colleges what we found that when they're not that important, we're trying to figure out why exactly. I think one of them is some of we talked about, like some of the trust behaviors, some of the disclosure that students do, and that sense of belonging that makes it really relevant. I've also talk about some of the rituals and ways and I think a ritual is a way to kind of encourage a sense of belonging that through other means than discussion, I guess. And so that's and so there's some things you can do, but one of the things that a study that I'm doing right now with Jory, who I think is on the line here with you folks, but we've been trying to look at really studying students who don't have that sense of belonging and do not feel like they connected with the program, and try to learn more about that. And so the good news is that study is all set up, and we're trying to do it. I don't know if this is good news. I guess it's good news, not from a researcher, but we have a really difficult time finding many students that have that feeling. So that's and so we've been trying to collect data on that, and hope to have more information about that in the future.
So if you have questions, go ahead and send it to chat or.
While we're waiting, I have a couple of questions of my own, if you don't mind. One is along the lines of what Jeff is asking about when it doesn't work, you know, and in the decade that y'all have been looking at this, are there certain trends or behaviors that you've seen kind of come and go because they have not been effective as a part of outdoor orientation?
I think one of the things that was interesting in my research is that there were a couple of outliers that just did not want to go to school. And what the outdoor orientation program did, which wasn't great for research, but was great for the student, was it made them make the decision to withdraw earlier. Like one gentleman wanted to basically go and learn to surf in Hawaii. And that was exactly what he wanted to do. He was kind of forced into going to UNH, and the group challenged him, saying, if that's what you really want to do, that's what you should do. So he withdrew within the first week of school.
I'd say, I think from a program standpoint, I've seen some programs that are less successful, and that's like another study that I've been doing with Krista Ricker at Tufts University, who is a graduate student here at UNH, and we've been thinking a lot about this, and I see that the program cultures change. So you folks that are directing programs at the outdoor leader culture, I think that things happen that we tend to have this great experience, feel this wonderful experience that leads to them wanting to become a leader. And then sometimes when they become a leader, that leader culture is so vibrant and wonderful to be a part of that it starts to sometimes get a little mission creep and gets away from serving the first years and starts to serve the leaders. And I think from that, then leaders start to, this mission creep leads to maybe more leader focused activities, maybe some like, how far can we push the first years? How can we best prank them in ways that are funny or entertaining? But then what happens is that starts to, I think, degrade the program's impact of it. And so one of the questions is like, how do you kind of capture back the leader culture focusing on the first years? And I know like at Tufts, Chris is she's very intentional about, it's about the first years, so they're talking about a new activity or something they want to do. It's like, is that what's best for the first years? It all comes back to the first years. And people kind of, I don't think people are against that, but sometimes they need to be reminded of what it's about, because the cultures can go in many different ways. And so I think that's an important consideration to keep things successful.
Your other question, Dan?
Yeah, related specifically to the Fireside and WVU models, I'm curious, what are those specific follow-up components that you're able to integrate throughout the rest of the program after that initial trip?
Halfway through the semester, we did a rock climbing reunion day, and we pulled out their goal sheets, and we asked them to evaluate and edit their goal sheets from what they had done prior to school. And then in January was overnight in winter conditions with a cabin very close because a lot of these people had not experienced snow with a big S. And then the spring follow-up was a trip to the challenge course where we pulled out the goal sheets again. And there was a lot of integration along the way, and much of the framework and the interpretation became pretty standard practice for the students to self-reflect on these experiences in the challenge course and the winter trip.
Yeah, and at West Virginia, the follow-up for those students is they're entered in a class, and so they have once a week meetings where they use that time to do a lot of intentional reflection on what's happened on the course. So in the course, they talk about challenges with like drug and alcohol use on campuses. They have those discussions in the outdoor environment, and then when they come back, they do workshops and talk and reflect upon that in their front country environment. And so that's kind of an example of there's like a curriculum of 10 lessons that they follow through. And but I think what part of the key of that is really that the students, as we all know, there's this idea of like, if you think about the experience, you reflect upon it, you can get so much more out of it. And they have, about 30 hours of that after the experience reflection, which I think helps a lot.
Great, thanks. And I see we have a few more questions coming in from panelists. Do you see those, or you want me to read them to you?
Yeah, a little blurry to me when I see that.
I'll take Nick's. What is a good predictor for success as a leader when you interview prospective student leaders? What's interesting is we have the current student leaders do the interview process for the incoming student leaders. And I think that once again engenders a sense of power and importance in that reality. I think empathy and relationship and caring are huge factors in the process of prospective students, because their work just doesn't end after the first 5 days. Well, on their own, leaders would make connections and stop in and see first-year students from their group and follow up throughout, many of the days. And the students that are willing to make that level of commitment, and in the eyes of the first-year students, I mean, these students are like unbelievable. When I grow up, I want to be like that student leader in their process. So I think that relationship is so strong, and the investment is something that you want to do as a predictor for success when you interview.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at I'm sorry, I want to do
and Jeff
glasses
Gary,
here, the glasses here.
What's interesting, Jeff, what you're talking about is context. I think the older that you get and the further that you get away from that 4 to 5 day experience, the more you remember the powerful things, whether they were true or not.
Yeah.
I remember interviewing a student 20 years later, and he said, I was on top of Mount Chicorowa, and I was looking down at the road that led back to UNH, and I said, I could take that road, or I would go back and I would just hang out with my, this is an in-state school, and this is a big in-state town that he related to, going back and hanging with those people from Nashua, New Hampshire. Or I could take the road that is less traveled. And he saw a road going an offshoot from the top of the mountain. He goes, I don't want to just take the road back that takes me to where I want to be. I want to go to somewhere where I don't know the ending. And to this day, he lives in Alaska. He's married to another student that was on his first year program. So it's quite influential in that piece. But he remembers that poignant day or that evening of looking down the road saying that was the road of the path I wanted to take, and I made a conscious decision to make that. Now, is that exactly what he thought that time at that particular junction in his life? I don't know, but that's the way he interpreted it now, and he's told it as vivid as it was yesterday.
Yeah, and I know that there's some research, like Stephen Keller did some research on looking at people who experienced NOLS and Outward Bound and Student Conservation Association, and found this sort of phenomena that the further they were away from the experience, the more powerful it had become. So, and I think that's, just to support what Mike was saying, I think that is true, that some of these experiences we don't reflect upon them for many years and kind of understand how important they are. I'll make this like personal, so I'm sitting here next to Dr. Gass, who was a very important person in my life as an undergraduate. But if you asked me my senior year, how important Mike was, I'd say yeah, he's pretty important. But 10 years later, that I only saw that he was more important than I thought then, and even more important I think back to it now. And so I think over my years, I get to recognize some of the power. Similarly, I think our trips kind of act like that, and I think that's good news for us, that they teach some important lessons that students keep sort of reflecting upon and still are alive in them, which is really nice.
Dan brought up a question to speak to what's the most effective and efficient methods of leader training. I think having you kind of trace through the beginning to the end, and then talking at junctures about how are we going to make this valuable for students. So for your staff training, if you kind of lead in the way in the past, so pre-trip investigations are critical, not only for risk management, but for effective training and leadership, to say, okay, this is the evening that we do the overnight vigil with the candle, that we keep up all night and people wake each other up. What do we do when they're journaling? What would you be doing this? What have other people found to be effective? Because some of the best leaders that become leaders are ones that were participants. So they can realize and empathize, saying, I was like this 2 years ago. This is what I would have done. What would people do? And to go work through in that type of manner is a valuable way for leader training.
Yeah, I would. And Dan, David Starbuck and I have an article that's coming out, I think in a few weeks in Journal, which is
nice.
on when we did an investigation of leader training, and it's really, and one of the things I think we found out of there is that the leaders tend to be really nervous about their technical skills, and they really don't feel like they're legitimate until they can do something successful. And so what we found is that until maybe they start a stove or they read a map correctly, they're very, very scared. And so that's one of the things that we thought about emphasizing possibly, is to make sure that you can get students to have, to really maybe have starting the stove really locked down solid, so that it doesn't lead to insecurity, but leads them, usually when they can pull that off, it just starts, and more confidence starts to immediately develop. So that was some of, I don't know, but please email me and I'll happy to send you that paper. I think it's kind of an interesting one.
Okay. We want to honor and respect people's time frames. So we're going to go with concluding thoughts, but just know that if you ever want to contact Brent or I, if you have other questions, you are certainly welcome to do so. So concluding thoughts are.
So we just want to say that, you know, the outdoor nutrition programs, that they're vibrant and they're growing. I think that we're at as Mike was saying to me earlier, just we're at a really great time with these at the moment. And that we have this sort of history, and I think that there's multiple histories and social influences have helped to organize these programs. And so I think that it's important to recognize those, and also to recognize that there are different theoretical models that exist. And so you want to try to find some consistency both with how you train your program, what you think it's doing, and then also is it consistent with what's going on in campus. And then, you know, that research is increasing rapidly, and I would say, and I think Mike agrees, that the future looks bright for us right now. So we're really hopeful that there's been a lot of growing research and a lot of thought and a lot of great new programs starting. So those are all good things for this.
And I would just say that looking at the people who are on this call right now, you are the real future of the field. And anything we can do to invest your influence and your effectiveness and your success is critical to anybody who wants to see the field grow. So let us know how we can serve you.
Yeah, and I cannot end without a little plug here for OOPS. So just so you know that I organize a meeting of outdoor orientation program directors twice a year, and so if some of you on the call have been to OOPS before, as you call it, but I highly encourage folks to please come and attend. This is our first 2-day OOPS as a pre-conference, and on the first day we're going to have a half day just working on how to create an assessment instrument at your campus. And then Greg Corio from West Virginia is going to talk about how to get a program funded by writing a proposal. And Greg, we talked about a little bit, has gotten over $1 million in funding for his program and has grown it to be one of the largest over the last, I guess it's been like 12 years he's been working. So it's so that's good. I just got a question, like how to enroll in tubes. That's Amanda. Well, Amanda, your campus has to allow it if you're you. But generally, I do this outdoor orientation benchmarking survey. If you want to participate in that, just email me. And what you basically need to do is we need to check with your campus for their IRB training, whether you get IRB permission from your campus. And once we have that secured, and sometimes you don't need it, some campuses want it, but it's fairly easy to do. And then what happens is I send out a survey to basically to you to send out a link to all your students on October 11th. And so about 6 weeks after your program has ended. And then I use that survey to compare different colleges to each other and also test out some of these dependent variables we've been talking about. So
thanks for your time and your work. Appreciate everyone's professional efforts. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and thanks for Dan for getting us on there. So good job.
Oh geez. Right back at you, gentlemen. I really appreciate we on behalf of AEE, they really appreciate you sort of holding the candle for this field and keeping track of it over the decades. One thing that's really striking to me as I hear you all talk is the value of these connections. You know, Mike, I think of you as the adventure therapy guy, and Brent, I think of you as the outdoor orientation guy, but the collaborations just between you and kind of representative of the collaborations that happen through AEE and OOPS and your efforts, Brent, it's just amazing, and we're really appreciative of the work that you've done, the way that you've brought us all together and made sure that when we have a chance to learn from each other, we're doing it. And that's sort of what AEE is all about, what this webinar is here for, and the work you've been doing with OOPS. So thank you all so much for being here, and look forward to seeing you in Montreal in November.
He's the man.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks everybody for coming. Have a great day.
All right,
yeah,
thanks,
thank
Dan.
you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.